Samuel chapter 14, and let's read these verses as we dive into it together. And the men of Israel were distressed that day, for Saul had adjured the people, or put them under an oath, saying, "Cursed be the man that eateth any food until evening, that I may avenge my enemies." So none of the people tasted any food. And all they of the land came to a wooded area, and there was honey upon the ground. And when the people were come into the woods, behold, the honey had dripped. But no man put his hand to his mouth, for the people feared the oath. But Jonathan heard not when his father charged the people with the oath. So he put forth the end of the rod that was in his hands and dipped it in the honeycomb and put his hand to his mouth, and he had a Winnie the Pooh moment. His eyes were enlightened. Then answered one of the people and said, "Thy father strictly charged the people with an oath, saying, Cursed be the man that eateth any food this day." And the people were faint. Then said Jonathan, "My father hath troubled the land. See, I pray you how mine eyes have been enlightened, because I tasted a little bit of this honey. How much more if happily the people had eaten freely today of the spoil of their enemies which they found? For had there been now a much greater slaughter among the Philistines." And so they smote the Philistines that day from Michmash to Ajalon, and the people were very faint. And the people flew upon the spoil and took sheep and oxen and calves and slew them on the ground, and the people did eat them with the blood. Then they told Saul, saying, "Behold, the people sin against the Lord, and that they eat with the blood." And he said, that is, Saul said to them, "Ye have transgressed. Roll a great stone unto me this day." And Saul said, "Disperse yourselves among the people, and say unto them, Bring me hither every man his ox, and every man his sheep, and slay them here, and eat, and sin not against the Lord in eating with the blood." And all the people brought every man his ox with him that night, and slew them there. And Saul built an altar unto the Lord, and the same was the first altar that he built unto the Lord. So Saul said, "Let us now go down after the Philistines by night, and spoil them unto the morning light, and let us not leave a man of them." And the people said, "Well, just do whatever seems good for thee." Then the priest spoke up, "Let us draw near hither unto God." So Saul asked counsel of God, "Shall I go down after the Philistines? Will you deliver them into the hand of Israel?" But God answered him not that day. And Saul said, "Draw ye near hither, all the chief of the people, and know and see wherein this sin hath been this day. For as the Lord lives, which saveth Israel, though it be in my son Jonathan, even he shall surely die." But there was not a man among all the people that answered him. Then said he unto all of Israel, "Be ye on one side, and I and Jonathan my son will be on the other side." And the people said unto Saul once again, Do what seemeth good for thee." Therefore Saul said unto the Lord God of Israel, "Give a perfect lot." And Saul and Jonathan were taken, but the people escaped. Saul said again, "Cast lots between me and Jonathan my son." And of course Jonathan was taken. So Saul said to Jonathan, "Tell me what you've done." And Jonathan told him and said, I did taste but a little bit of honey with the end of the rod that was in mine hand, and I guess now I must die." And Saul answered, "God do so and more also, for thou shalt surely die, Jonathan." And the people said to Saul, "Shall Jonathan die, who hath wrought this great salvation in Israel? God forbid. As the Lord lives, there shall not one hair of his head fall to the ground, for he hath wrought with God this day." So the people rescued Jonathan, and he died not. So Saul went up from following the Philistines, and the Philistines went to their own place. Saul took the kingdom over Israel, fought against all of the enemies on every side, Moab, Ammon, Edom, the kings of Zobah, and against the Philistines. And whithersoever he turned himself, he vexed them. And he gathered a host and smote the Amalekites and delivered Israel out of the hands of them that spoiled them. Now the sons of Saul were Jonathan, Ishui, Melchishua, and the names of his two daughters were these: the name of the firstborn, Merab, and the name of the younger, Michal. And the name of Saul's wife was Ahinoam, the daughter of Ahimaaz. And the name of the captain of his host was Abner, the son of Ner, Saul's uncle. And Kish was the father of Saul, and Ner, the father of Abner, was the son of Abihail. And there was sore war against the Philistines all the days of Saul. And when Saul saw any strong man or any valiant man, he took him unto him. Well, Saul is quite the figure, isn't he? On the outside, he's got it all together. In fact, you couldn't find a better king in terms of physical stature. He's exactly what the people described they wanted in an earthly monarchy. But make no mistake, Saul is a fool. He's a fool. It doesn't matter that he is a masterpiece outwardly, because internally he is a tragic and foolish leader. And let me just say something about foolish individuals. One of the key characteristics of a fool is that a fool refuses to change. In fact, a fool prides himself in always remaining the same, never changing. And that's exactly what is the characteristic of Paul's life, or Saul's life, rather. As we continue through chapter 14, we see the ongoing foolishness of King Saul. Now, it's been a while since we've been here, and I hope you remember the events of verses 1 through 23. Let me rehearse them briefly with you. You'll remember that Israel was in battle against the Philistines, and frankly, it wasn't looking good. So we are introduced at the beginning of chapter 14 to Saul's son, Jonathan. He was a heroic man, a godly man. And in an act of great faith in God's power and in God's will, he chooses to attack a Philistine garrison with just his armor bearer. In fact, if you remember the story, they approach this area, and he looks over to his armor bearer, just the two of them, and he says to his armor bearer, "This is my plan. We're going to go, and if God provides, we're going to fight, and we'll know it's the Lord's will. And if it be the Lord's will, he may even save Israel today." You remember that? And what was it that his armor bearer said to him? He said to him, "I am with you, heart and soul." I am with you, heart and soul. I love this. And I know that we touched on it a great deal when we were studying the first 23 verses of chapter 14, but let me just remind us all tonight. May God give us partnerships like the one Jonathan had. That when God gives us a vision to move forward, when God lays something upon our heart to go forward into God's will and God's graces and God's power, may God surround us with partners who say, "I am with you. I am with you, heart and soul, however the Lord may be leading you." And that's exactly what Jonathan's armor bearer did for him. Jonathan said, "This is what we're going to do. And if it be the Lord's will, the Lord will deliver us." And his armor bearer didn't fight him. He didn't pour water on his fire. He didn't water down, if you will, his vision, his desire. No, he came alongside of him and said, "Listen, I don't even know if this is going to work out, but I am with you, and I am with you, heart and soul." And so together they went. And they attacked the Philistine garrison, and it sent the whole army into a panic. The Bible said that the Lord confused them. It confused the Philistines so much that they began to turn on one another. They began to kill themselves. The whole scene was a miracle of God. In fact, in verse 23, the Bible tells us clearly that as a result of Jonathan's faith, that the Lord saved Israel that day. And where was Saul when all of this was going on? Well, Saul had checked out. He's sitting under a pomegranate tree, sipping on his latte, just hoping everything was going to turn out for the good. Yet Jonathan was the one, his son, the opposite of everything that Saul was. He was active. He was by faith involved. He was moving forward while Saul was wasting time in the background. That's verses 1 through 23. But when we come to verse 24, we see the author of 1 Samuel doing something that a lot of authors of the Bible do, especially when they're unveiling these narratives for us. They'll sometimes give us a little flashback of an event that took place in the middle of the story. And that's what we have in verse 24. From verse 24 all the way down really to verse 46, we have a flashback, the unfolding of a story within a story. And here's how it begins in verse 24. Look at it there again. And the men of Israel were distressed that day. On the same day that God had sent the Philistines into a panic, the same day that the army of Israel were a distressed, burdened group of men. And the question is, why? Why were they so distressed? Well, frankly, because of the foolishness of King Saul. I want you to write down these 4 things as we consider foolish Saul. Number 1, I want you to look with me at Saul's foolish oath. That is seen throughout this whole story, but particularly here at the beginning, verses 24 through 33. Saul's foolish oath. And the oath is clear. Look at verse 24. The men of Israel were distressed that day because Saul had adjured the people. He had put them under an oath. And here's what the oath said. Cursed be the man that eateth any food until the evening. The oath is clear. If you eat while I am avenging my enemies, all right? If you eat while I am bringing vengeance upon my enemies, you will be cursed. That's what he says to his army. Now, there are 3 problems with this oath that I've written down. These are not in your notes. You'll find them on the screen. But I want to encourage you to at least jot them down there in the note column because I think this will help you to understand why this oath that Saul makes is so foolish. The first thing that I wrote down is this, is that the oath was about Saul and not about God. This is where we begin. It was a foolish oath because the oath was about Saul and not about God. Again, look at verse 24. He says, cursed be the man, all right? If you eat, you will be cursed. And here's the reason why. That I may be avenged of my enemies. Don't eat any food before I have taken vengeance out on my enemies. And if you eat any food before I have taken vengeance out on my enemies, you will die. You will be cursed. Again, we see a polar opposite between father and son, don't we? Jonathan, who just at the beginning of this battle, he was solely focused on the Lord. He was focused on the Lord's will. He was focused on the Lord's power. He believed that God could do the impossible and deliver Israel. While at the same time, his father was focused on a battle that he viewed to be his battle and not the Lord's. Saul wasn't viewing this thing as his or as the Lord's. He was viewing it as his. Everything about this was about Saul. Before I have taken vengeance on my enemies. And that's the problem with this oath at the beginning. Nothing about this oath had anything to do with God. Nothing. It was all about Saul. And the sad reality is that he was willing to deprive his own men in order to put himself in an exalted position of success. So King Saul is acting out very foolishly. He's giving a foolish oath because, one, the oath was about Saul and not about God. Here's the second problem with the oath. The oath distressed his men and hindered them from being more effective. The oath distressed his men and hindered them from being more effective. Now notice how many times we see a reference to their extreme distress. You see it in verse 24. The Bible says they, the army, the men, they were distressed that day. We see it again in verse 26. The people feared the oath. Verse 28, the people were faint. Verse 29, my father, Jonathan says, has troubled the people, troubled the land. But we see it again in verse 31. The people were very faint. This is important because in ancient times, soldiers had to provide their own food with the spoils of their enemies. And just like any type of physical work, when we are exerting a great deal of energy, it is needful to have something to restore and replenish us. Kind of hard to go to battle on an empty stomach. That's the imagery here. How in the world is Saul to expect his men to plunder the Philistines, to destroy them, to push them away if he's not providing them any sustenance and energy to actually do the job? We can understand what that's like. We all have that 3 o'clock feeling, and you know what it is that gives you that extra energy to push you through. For some of us, it's a couple extra doses of coffee. It might be an energy bar or a Snicker bar or whatever it may be. We know what it's like. It is hard to focus. It is hard to do your work when your clock is going off, if you will. And so that's the scene. The men are being expected to do something that takes a lot of energy and exertion, but yet their leader is depriving them of that. And by refusing his men this freedom, perhaps maybe in an effort to motivate them, Saul had actually weakened them. Jonathan alludes to that in verses 29 and 30. Look at verse 29, what he said after he had eaten the honey. Verse 29, this said, Jonathan, my father had troubled the land. See, I pray you how my eyes have been enlightened. Look at me. I tasted a little bit of this honey, and I feel like I could keep going. How much more, verse 30, if the people had been given the freedom to eat the spoil of their enemies, there would have been even greater success, he says, against the Philistines. Now, let me give you a little word about Jonathan while we're here. I don't have time to go into all of this, but Jonathan had not heard about the oath, obviously, that his father made when he came across the honey in verses 25 and 26. After all, Jonathan and his armor bearer was way ahead of the rest of the people. And so Saul had given out this information, all right, nobody eats until we spoil the enemies, until I take vengeance upon the Philistines. Now, Jonathan didn't know about it. He wasn't aware of it. So not only did he eat it, but verse 27 says the honey helped him. It was then that one of the men came to Jonathan's side and informed him of his father's oath. And that's why Jonathan replied in verse 29 by telling them, look, my father has made a bad decision. He's established a foolish and silly rule, and it's troubled the people. That's why this oath is a problem. It's a problem because the oath was about Saul and not about God. It's a problem because the oath distressed his men and hindered them from being more effective. There's a third reason why the oath is a problem, why it's foolish. Because the oath, and I term it here as a man-centered oath. This man-centered oath led to the mass disobedience of the actual law of God. Now think about this. Because when we come to verse 31 assumes that evening had already come. So, according to the oath, they weren't allowed to eat anything until evening. So, when we get to verse 31, evening had come. They were now able to eat. The problem is, they were so deprived by King Saul, they were so famished, that they ate what they were not supposed to eat as Israelite people. Look at it in verse 31. And they smote the Philistines that day from Michmash to Ajalon, and the people were very faint. So what they did was they flew. That is, they ravished upon the spoil. The picture would be like you having some pizza tonight, and you've got a lot of teenagers in your home, and as soon as you put the pizza out, it's like, come get some pizza. But before you can even finish the sentence, the pizza's already gone, right? They've jumped on it. They've ravished it. There are no pepperonis left to be found. That's the image here. These guys are hungry. They've had no food whatsoever. And as soon as evening comes, they fly upon the spoil. They took sheep and oxen and calves and slew them on the ground. And the issue here is, verse 32, look at the end of it. The people ate this meat with the blood still in it. That's the problem. The problem was that the Israelites were not supposed to eat any meat with the blood still in it. It was a part of the Levitical law. You can read about it in Leviticus chapter 8, Leviticus chapter 17, as God establishes this right for the people. They were not allowed to eat anything with the blood still in it because the blood represented life. And it was the blood of sacrificial animals that actually made atonement for sin. So it was repulsive to God for His people to eat any meat with blood still in it because of that very thing. But Saul created an environment that day in his own army where his man-made rule had overthrown their actual obedience to God's law. He had deprived them with something that did not matter, which furthermore led them to abuse something that did matter. Why is this oath a problem? Well, this oath is a problem because it led to the mass disobedience of the actual law of God. So let's get real honest tonight. Because if you have put your phones away and you're actually thinking this evening, you might already see what is coming to the surface here. Because what we have in 1 Samuel 14 is King Saul as an Old Testament version of a legalistic Pharisee. That's what we have. He is the Old Testament version, the Old Testament representation of what Jesus' New Testament enemies were. Think about it. You got to think about it and listen to me. He required more. He required more of his men than what God had asked of them. Their effectiveness in battle would have been far greater had his man-centered, unbiblical restrictions not held them back. And he created within them a greater fear of his standard than they had in respect to God's standard. How do we not see why this is such a problem? And how is it that we can't see that this is you and me? Do you expect others to live by silly rules that God never speaks about? Is our gospel effectiveness as a church, I'm talking about Laurel Baptist Church tonight, is our gospel effectiveness as a church being hindered by man-invented rules? Are we standing for and separating over things that reveal we have more a fear of man and tradition than we do a fear of God and truth. You know why Saul was a fool? He was a fool because he was a legalist. He was a fool because he cared more about his rules, his traditions, his unfounded expectations than he did the actual law of God. I don't want to be a foolish leader. I don't want to be a foolish leader to my wife. I don't want to be a foolish leader to my children. I certainly don't want to be a foolish leader to this church. And I want you to know that I've been guilty of this in the past. Even as your pastor at times, I too am guilty of expecting people to live by silly rules that I've invented. There have been times that in brokenness and remorse that I admit to you, that in foolishness, I feel like that our church has been hindered. That we could have been more effective for the gospel had we just put aside the traditions of what we've always heard and actually did what the Bible said. I don't want to be a foolish leader. And although I've been guilty of that in the past, I want you to hear me loudly and clearly, and nobody in this room knows this more than my wife. I am thankful tonight that God has changed me. Perhaps the biggest change that's taken place in this ministry in 13 years is me. The change that God has made in me. I'm not the same guy. And I'm thankful for that because growing Christians always change. They always do. Foolish people never change. They never do. Let's not be foolish. Let's not wave flags and standards and banners that the Bible speaks not of. Let's not hinder the next generation from coming up in this church and doing great and mighty things for God because we don't want to let go of the traditions that we've enjoyed. Let's not keep people from knowing the gospel of Jesus Christ because they don't understand it in the way that we've understood it. Let us swallow our pride. Let us understand that our oath for this many services, or our oath for this particular translation, or our oath for that ministry may be more about us than it ever had to do with God. And in the meantime, let us not forget what Jesus said about the type of people that you and I have a tendency to be. From the lips of Jesus, he said to the Pharisees in Mark 7, "In vain you worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. For laying aside the commandment of God, you would rather hold to the tradition of men." In fact, he goes on to say in verse 9, "All too well and often you reject the commandment of God just so that you can keep your foolish tradition." Saul's foolish oath. Number 2, Saul's artificial religion. Saul's artificial religion. You come to verse 34, Saul starts, pointing out everybody's sin and wanting to build an altar. It would actually look like he's concerned about spiritual things now. He rebukes them for eating meat with blood, and then he decides that it might be best to build an altar because they had violated God's law. But he's not even slightly, for a single moment, taking the blame for a problem that he had actually created. Isn't that interesting? Look at it there in verse 34. Saul said, "Disperse yourselves among the people." Say unto them, bring me this ox and sheep, and slay them here, eat. Sin not against the Lord. So all the people brought them the meat, they slew them there, and he built an altar unto the Lord, and the same as the first altar that he built unto the Lord. In fact, in verse 33, at the end of it, he looks at the people before he gives them that command, and he says to them strictly, you have transgressed. You have transgressed. He didn't say, I've transgressed. No, you're the problem, not me. That's how Saul led. And I think there are two reasons why I feel that this is an artificial religious moment. Let's not get wrapped up in the fact that he's building an altar and preaching sin against the people. Two reasons I wrote down here in my notes. Number one, after his religious observance, he immediately reverts back to his goal of seeking vengeance on his enemies. That's how we know it wasn't sincere. It's like he's got to fit this in real quickly, all right? All right, you're the problem. You've eaten all this meat with blood in it. You're the reason why we're not going to win. So everybody, hey, we got to huddle up, do the religious thing and build the altar, pray to God, seek his will. And then as soon as he does it, what does he say in verse 36? And Saul said, let us go down after them Philistines. I mean, think about it tonight, church. Again, he has no mention of God here, no mention of God whatsoever. It's still all about him. He uses a religious observance just to somewhat appease his heart about still seeking vengeance on his enemies. That's why, one of the reasons, I believe this was an artificial religion on Saul's part. The second reason is this. I wrote down this. Someone else had to remind Saul of God. This is terrible. I mean, he wants to talk all spiritual and such. But someone else actually has to remind him whether or not they should pray about this. Look at it there in verse 37. I'm sorry, verse 36. Saul said, let us go down after the Philistines by night, spoil them into the morning light. Let's not leave one man behind. We're going to wipe them all out. Of course, you can tell the people have already lost confidence in Saul. Unlike Jonathan's armor bearer, who looked at Jonathan as leader and said, I'm with you, heart and soul. The people look at Saul and said, okay, just do whatever's good for you, I guess. Because that's what you're going to do anyway. And then said the priest to Saul, don't you think we ought to draw near to God first? It's fascinating to me. Don't you think we ought to pray about this first? Someone else had to remind Saul about God. This wasn't true religion. Saul was a man of artificial religion. But Saul prays anyway. Verse 37. Oh, yeah, you're right. We probably should, It's like when you sit down at the dinner table, right? And you haven't eaten in hours and it's behind schedule and you happen to peek in there and the kids are going crazy. And guys, don't you think we ought to pray first? Yeah, we should. You're right. Pray. This is Saul. Ready to go fight him, kill him, take him. Saul, don't you think we ought to ask God what he thinks about this? So he does. But at the end of verse 37, God chooses not to answer. It's interesting to me, this whole episode, because this is often as well true about legalistic Pharisees. They spiritualize their man-centered environment by religious practices. Yet, they haven't truly considered the heart of God in the matter. They know what they want. But they haven't stopped to think what God wants. Which leads me to the third one, and that's Saul's stubborn pride. We see his foolish oath. We see his artificial religion. We see now his stubborn pride. So he concurs. He does what the priest recommends. He prays. And he asked God specifically in verse 37 whether or not he should go down to the Philistines and if God would deliver him if they do go. But of course God didn't answer him. God was silent. And Saul assumes that God's silence was the result, again, not of his wrongdoing, but the fault of someone else. Look at it in verse 38. And Saul said, "Draw ye near hither, all the chief of the people, and let us know and see today where this sin is at." In other words, I've not done anything wrong. Somebody in my army's done something wrong. God's not even answering us. So let's get the whole people together right now. We're going to find out which one of you phonies have sinned against God. Again, we have another key characteristic of foolishness. Assuming that others are the ones wrong while refusing to evaluate our own possible error. I'm not the problem, you're the problem. Not my standard, it's your lack of standard. It's a blame game. But Saul is stubborn. He's prideful. He demands to know who broke his oath. And so he makes another oath. Really smart idea, isn't it? And the oath is simple. Verse 39, whoever's guilty, even if it's my own son, he's going to be put to death. Wow. Saul had no idea at this point. This is how stubborn, prideful, bold, and brazen he is. He comes up with a second rule, a second oath, and swears it even upon his own son's life. I am more concerned about my oath being kept than if it means my own son dies because of it. We're going to find out who did it. But how did the people respond? Well, it's ironic. They're silent. They know. And verse 39 says, there was not a man among them that would answer him. Here's the irony. God is silent toward Saul, and now his own men are silent toward him. This is how much he's isolated himself. But in that stubborn pride, what does he do? He keeps pushing the issue. He should have never made the first oath to begin with. And now he foolishly and impulsively makes another oath. And since the men will not identify the guilty one, Saul decides, hey, we're going to cast lots to determine who it is. That's the language of verses 40 and 41. Again, I don't have time to go into all of this, but the whole idea of casting a perfect lot, it was a procedure that the priests would often do to receive a clear answer from God. It was like rolling dice. That's the best way in modern terms that I can even give you a picture of it, even though that's not really identically to what it is. They would cast these lots, and you could get one or three answers. You could get yes, you could get no, or the third one would be no answer at all. So anytime they wanted to get a clear answer, that was the procedure they would take. They would cast lots, and they would know that those lots, however it fell, was God's way of communicating to them in these difficult times. So Saul goes through this process until it comes down to he and his son. They cast the lots, and basically, however it worked, the lot showed that it was nobody else in the army. It was either Saul or Jonathan. Now, at that point, Saul should have realized, I have probably said too much. Because I don't think I had anything to eat here. And I don't want my own son's life to be taken by my foolish rules. So at that point, he probably should have said, you know what? This is a bad idea. I forgive you. I don't care who ate the honey. Let's just go get them Philistines. But foolish, prideful, stubborn leaders never do it. They want to win. They want their voice to be heard. They want to stake their claim, prove themselves. And eventually, verse 42, Jonathan was revealed to be the guilty one. Saul looks at Jonathan. Look at it, verse 43. Saul said to Jonathan, tell me what you have done. And you can almost sense maybe sarcasm here. It's as if Jonathan's response to his own dad shows just how foolish his daddy's rule was. Because Jonathan says, I did taste a little honey with the end of the rod that was in my hand, and I guess now I must die. It sounds foolish, doesn't it? I mean, when you step back and hear Jonathan say it like that, this is kind of ridiculous. That his son has to die because he took a stick, dipped it in a little bit of honey, even though God was okay with it, and he ate it. The truth is, if you and I would just sit back and think about all the extra biblical rules we emphasize, I think we'd also conclude that they're just as silly and foolish as others think them to be. It's okay to use common sense on whatever the issue may be. Saul doesn't do that. And I think the hardest part of his stubborn pride is when we come to verse 44. We see that he was prepared to kill his son because of the silliness of his own oath. Isn't this terrible? Look at verse 44. And Saul answered, God, do so and more. For thou shalt surely die, Jonathan. How can a father look at his son and say these words knowing that it was own, quote-unquote, legalism that put his son in this position? I think it's interesting to consider how often our hard positions may hinder or even destroy the spiritual good of our own children. Whether you who have a tendency to hard fast to the traditions of the past, more so than maybe I, whatever the case may be, whether you agree with these things or not, it does not matter. Because the gospel work that God has done in my own life and transformation is more so for the benefit of my children than I want it to be for the benefit of anyone else. I'm not willing to die on certain things that maybe you once were, and I don't really think you are now, if it means that my own children could be swayed from following the Jesus that I love. And unfortunately, some of the hardest, most legalistic voices I know have adult children today who are deterred from anything that remotely resembles Christianity. He was willing to let his own son die instead of saying, you know what, maybe I was wrong. I got to stop, but you have to know whether or not Jonathan dies. So can I tell you? The people intervened, and obviously they would not allow Saul to kill his son. Verse 45 and verse 46, and let me just summarize here, that it was obvious that God's hand was on Jonathan and that it was Jonathan's faith God chose to bless and to use to bring victory to Israel, not his father's rules. It wasn't Saul. They knew that. Saul was a fool. Yep, the same man that they had rallied to be their king, they had now understood he's a fool. But Jonathan is a godly man. And we're not going to allow him to die on our watch. For that reason, Jonathan had the heart of the people. And they rescued him. That's what it says at the end of verse 45. You are not going to take away this man from us, by whom we know we would not be here today had it not been for his faith. You are not going to kill him. So the Bible says the people rescued Jonathan, and he died not. We must be careful, church, not to lose the generation following us because we are unwilling to acknowledge that just maybe, your position for all these years is a little bit foolish. Write down number 4. We're done. Saul's tragic reign. Verse 47 through 52 is actually kind of odd because you typically wouldn't see this whole lineage, what he did, until his life's over. And there's a whole lot more to see about Saul. So why in the world did the author include it here? Well, frankly, I don't know. But I did note 2 things. Number 1, Saul's failure as king had nothing to do with his military qualifications or his physical stature. His failure was a failure of the heart. Because when you read verses 47 through 15, he'd done everything militarily that you'd want in a king to do. But that wasn't the problem. The problem was who he was in here. The second thing I wrote down is that he had a family. Well, big whoop, Pastor. Everybody has a family, yeah. And we need to remember that sometimes before we establish stupid rules that destroy them. Third thing I wrote down is that he never did deal fully with the problem he was anointed for. Did you notice verse 52? Look at it, verse 52. And there was war against the Philistines all the days of Saul. All the days of Saul. What was it he was anointed to do? To drive out the Philistines. And he never did it. Never did it. All of this, I think, God wants us to see for one main purpose. To point us to Jesus. For Jesus is everything Saul failed to be. Do you believe that? He is everything Saul failed to be. And when you begin to see yourself in Saul, as sometimes I do, it reminds me that I am far from the answer. But Jesus is the answer. This series is a tale of 3 kings, not 2. It's about Saul. It will be in the next coming weeks about David, but more than that, it's about Jesus. How about before you live and die by that rule, why don't you look to Jesus? Before you run somebody out of your life like Saul was about to do with Jonathan, why don't you look to Jesus first and ask yourself whether or not it's worth it? Let's not be stubborn, artificial, prideful, foolish people. May God do His work in your heart that only He can. Stand with me for prayer. We're going to pray and we'll leave.